work? Well, one is clearly, where is the poverty? Because there's a clear link between the need for an international humanitarian response and the vulnerability in countries. And vulnerability is linked to the poverty, and we've seen a number of countries that are least developed countries has been going down, and probably in 10, 15 years, most of that vulnerability will be in least developed, a smaller number of least developed fragile states. So that's one clear trend. A second issue linked to vulnerability is global climate change. This is clearly exacerbating the frequency and severity of natural disasters. It's also affecting, maybe will make it harder for some countries to move away from being least developed countries to middle income countries, and maybe even cause some reversals. So climate change, though, is clearly a major trend. If we combine the issue of where the poverty is and that broader issue of climate change, there are a number of sub-trends that are emerging. One is that the distinction between environmental emergencies on the one hand and complex political emergencies is blurring. The second sub-trend is the idea of thinking of a humanitarian emergency or a crisis as something that occurs infrequently, because in many of the places we're seeing, again, because of those larger trends, we're seeing now really prolonged crisis. And a third trend is clearly, again, the scale of the emergencies. We're seeing, of course, regional scale emergencies. I'd also highlight a few other trends at sort of the next level of detail down. One is that clearly governments are wanting to play a much more active role in their own responses. A second is that there are clearly new sources of finance available, and actually new players implementing humanitarian responses, like the private sector. The most significant challenge for the community is going to be climate change. I think it is the defining issue of our day, and it is going to affect virtually everything. The challenges relate to, first of all, our capacity to respond. But also, I think it will also erode our link to our capacity, the resourcing we can mobilize from the public. There is a real question about the continuing willingness of countries to provide funding to appeals. And then dealing with those other trends that I mentioned a moment ago, new players might not share commitment to humanitarian principles, the assertiveness of governments, which is actually entirely to be welcomed and celebrated, the working more effectively with partners, local NGOs, because in many countries there are now vibrant civil societies. We should be building the national capacity, supporting a government capacity to respond, certainly in natural disasters. In terms of opportunities, well, I think there is a big opportunity in light of those threats to really focus on the links between humanitarian and development. The essential point is, what's the most efficient way, in the light of this increasing vulnerability in the world, to mobilize the existing resources to achieve the best outcomes for people. And clearly prevention is hugely advantageous. And there are also some big opportunities linked to climate change financing, which is maybe the only area where we'll start seeing some additional funding, although quite a bit of that may come through private sector or non-traditional aid sources. There's sort of competing trends that maybe are required to answer that. The one is the emergence of more middle-income countries and the decrease in the number of countries that are formally sort of designated as least developed states. And that trend, if it continues, means there are a fewer number of countries where the international community is engaging in humanitarian response. So there's a shrinking market on the one hand. Or I should say there's at least domestic capacity to respond that wasn't there before. The competing trend is climate change, because that is going to greatly increase the burden on countries to respond. So it's really a question of how that will play out. So those two competing trends are going to be key in determining, and shaping what the sector looks like. But the other that is clearly the case is that there will be many more actors in the humanitarian space, whether it's local NGOs, the private sector, the military, and And this will create increased competition for the international, looked at purely as a, from the funding perspective, increased competition and for the humanitarian sector, but also increased challenges with respect to humanitarian principles in how responses happen. In light of this picture that we've been discussing about how the sector is changing, it means the whole issue of standards and accountability becomes even more important from a whole variety of perspectives. One, to demonstrate and to reinforce, first of all, the learning in our own organizations. That's the starting point. This is about improving quality fundamentally. But linked to that is the idea of demonstrating to increasingly assertive and nationalistic governments to demonstrate the value that the international humanitarian community can provide in an emergency. And part of that is, how do we know you do a good job? What are your standards? How do you demonstrate that you achieve those standards? How accountable are you to local communities and to us as governments? So I think for Sphere, that is a continuing and actually a growing need. The second area is linked to that is with new actors participating there. And if you imagine that to put it crudely, the market share of international humanitarian response that goes to the current players in the international humanitarian community is shrinking, the proportion anyway is shrinking, even if the larger pot we hope will increase. Then there's a whole new segment of players that need to be engaged in the discussion of standards and principles. There's a need to reinforce and re-engage new players and new power centers in discussions of principles and of standards more, at the operational level as well.